December 19th, 1944. 23,000 feet above the frozen landscape of eastern Germany, 42 consolidated B-24. Liberator heavy bombers droned westward through air so cold it turned breath to ice crystals in seconds. Each aircraft carried 10 exhausted crew members who believed they were flying home to hot food and warm beds after completing their mission over synthetic oil refineries near Leipzig. They had no idea that within the next 90 minutes, a problem so mundane it would later seem almost comical would threaten to send every single one of them plummeting from the sky. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these men were about to discover would reveal how the thinnest margin between triumph and catastrophe in modern warfare often came down not to superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but to the creative thinking of ordinary people facing extraordinary problems with nothing but the contents of their pockets. Technical Sergeant Robert Chen of the 392nd Bombardment Group had flown 28 missions over occupied Europe. At 23 years old, he knew the Boeing B-17 inside and out, but the B-24 Liberator was a different beast entirely. Consolidated Aircraft had designed it for range and payload, not comfort. Where the Flying Fortress felt solid, almost forgiving, the Liberator demanded constant attention. Its Davis wing design gave it impressive fuel efficiency, but that same high aspect ratio wing made it less stable in turbulence. The flight controls required constant small corrections, especially when flying in tight formation through the buffeting wake of other aircraft. Chen sat at the flight engineers station behind the pilots, monitoring 4 Pratt & Whitney R1800 twin Wasp engines that together produced 4,800 horsepower. Each engine was a mechanical marvel. 14 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, breathing through superchargers that compressed thin, high-altitude air to keep them running at power settings that would have destroyed lesser designs. But Chen was not thinking about the engines that December afternoon. His attention was fixed on something far more mundane, a cluster of hydraulic pressure gauges that had begun showing readings that made his stomach tighten with fear. Lieutenant James Kosciuszko, the pilot, noticed Chen's posture change. Kosciuszko was a third-generation Polish-American from Milwaukee who had learned to fly crop dusters over Wisconsin farmland before the conflict began. He understood machines the way some men understood music, through intuition refined by experience. "What have you got, Chen?" Kosciuszko asked through the intercom, his voice crackling with radio static. "Hydraulics are dropping on number 3 system," Chen replied, tapping the gauge as if that might correct the reading. "Started about 5 minutes ago. Pressure is down from 3,000 pounds per square inch to 2,200 and falling." The hydraulic systems on the B-24 were not redundant backups, but rather divided responsibilities. System 3 controlled the landing gear extension mechanism. Without hydraulic pressure, the main gear would not come down. And without landing gear, a 40-ton bomber loaded with remaining fuel would have to attempt a belly landing, an evolution that rarely ended well for anyone aboard. "Can you isolate it?" Kosciuszko asked, already running through emergency procedures in his mind. Chen was ahead of him, fingers moving across valves and switches with practiced efficiency. "I am trying to route pressure from System 2, but the crossover valve is not responding. I think we have got ice formation in the lines." This was the brutal mathematics of high-altitude flight in winter. The B-24 cruised at altitudes where outside temperatures regularly dropped to 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Any moisture in the hydraulic fluid could freeze, forming ice crystals that blocked narrow passages or seized mechanical components. The military specifications called for hydraulic fluid that was supposed to remain liquid down to 65 degrees below 0. But specifications and reality did not always align, especially with fluids that had been contaminated during hurried maintenance procedures at forward bases. Captain Harold Zimmerman, a veteran of 31 missions who was riding as group maintenance officer in the lead aircraft, came over the radio frequency reserved for formation leaders. "All aircraft, this is Group Lead. Report hydraulic status on System 3 landing gear circuits." The responses came back in rapid succession, each one driving home the scope of the crisis. Aircraft after aircraft reported dropping pressure. Within 10 minutes, it became clear that 39 of the 42 bombers in the formation were experiencing the same problem. The 3 exceptions were aircraft that had received complete hydraulic system overhauls the previous week, using fresh fluid from sealed containers that had been stored indoors. Zimmerman felt his mouth go dry. He had commanded men through flak barrages that turned the sky black with shrapnel, through fighter attacks that came screaming out of the sun with cannons blazing, through mechanical failures that required shutting down engines and nursing crippled bombers back to England on prayers and determination. But this was different. This was not enemy action, but simple physics, and physics did not negotiate or show mercy. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. They were approximately 90 minutes from their base at Wendling in Norfolk, England. Current hydraulic pressure loss rates suggested that most aircraft would have completely frozen landing gear systems long before they crossed the English Channel. Emergency procedures existed for belly landings, but attempting 42 such landings simultaneously would overwhelm every emergency service in eastern England. Fire crews, ambulances, surgical teams, all would be stretched beyond capacity. Statistically, based on previous belly landing incidents, at least 15 aircraft would suffer catastrophic fires. Survival rates for those fires averaged 30%. Zimmerman did the mental calculation he wished he did not have to make. 420 crew members in the formation. If 15 aircraft burned, that meant 150 men in immediate danger. 30% survival meant 105 fatalities. 105 men who had survived missions over Berlin and Ploesti and Schweinfurt, who had dodged flak and fighters and all the deadly mechanisms of modern aerial warfare, would die in crashes at their home field because of frozen hydraulic fluid. He keyed the radio. All aircraft. This is Group Lead. We need solutions and we need them now. Every officer and senior enlisted man start thinking, what can we use to restore heat to these hydraulic lines? In Zimmerman's aircraft, Master Sergeant Frank Kowalski, the crew chief, was already pulling open access panels. Kowalski had worked as an automotive mechanic in Detroit before the conflict, specializing in high-performance racing engines. He understood that heat transfer was about surface area, contact, and thermal mass. The problem is location, Kowalski said to his assistant. The hydraulic lines run through the wheel wells. At altitude, those wells are exposed to slipstream air at 40 below. Even if we had portable heaters, we could not get them positioned close enough to matter. Second Lieutenant David Rosenbaum, the bombardier, had been listening from his position in the nose. Rosenbaum had studied chemical engineering at MIT before the conflict interrupted his education. "What if we do not try to heat the lines directly?" he asked. "What if we raise the temperature of the fluid before it gets to the frozen section?" Kowalski considered this. The hydraulic pumps are engine-driven, mounted on the accessory case. They are already warm from engine heat, but the fluid cools as it travels through the lines. "What is the flow rate?" Rosenbaum asked. "Approximately 6 gallons per minute at operating pressure," Kowalski replied. "And the line diameter? 3/8 inch for the main trunks, 1/4 inch for the branches." Rosenbaum pulled out a pencil and began calculating on the back of his navigation log. If we could add heat at the pump outlet, enough to raise fluid temperature by even 20 degrees, that might be sufficient to keep the downstream sections above freezing point. The question is heat source. They inventoried everything available. The aircraft carried emergency equipment including flare guns, survival kits, and a small medical supply chest. None of these offered a practical heat source that could be safely applied to pressurized hydraulic lines. It was Staff Sergeant Raymond Tucker, the tail gunner, who made the suggestion that would later seem so obvious that men would wonder why it took them so long to think of it. Tucker was from rural Alabama, where people learned to improvise solutions using whatever materials were at hand. "What about body heat?" Tucker asked over the intercom. "We are warm-blooded. Our hands are 98.6 degrees. What if we just wrapped ourselves around those pump housings?" There was a moment of silence as everyone processed this. Then Kowalski spoke up. "That might actually work. The pumps are accessible through the engine nacelle crawlways. They are not comfortable spaces, but a man could get in there, and direct skin contact with metal would transfer heat pretty efficiently." Zimmerman made a command decision. All aircraft, this is Group Lead. I want volunteer crew members to access your engine nacelles and make direct physical contact with hydraulic pump housings. Use body heat to keep those pumps warm. Rotate personnel every 10 minutes to prevent hypothermia. The responses came back immediately. In 42 aircraft scattered across several miles of sky, men began squeezing themselves into cramped maintenance crawl spaces never designed for occupied human presence. They stripped off flight jackets and pressed bare arms against metal pump housings, trying to will their body heat into machinery that had never been designed to receive it. It helped. Temperature sensors showed the pump housings warming slightly, but it was not enough. The hydraulic lines were long, running from the engines in the wings all the way back to the landing gear mechanisms in the fuselage and wheel wells. Body heat applied at the pumps could not prevent freezing in lines that stretched through unheated spaces. Chen studied the problem from his engineer's station. "We need something that stays warm longer than skin contact," he said. "Something we can wrap around the actual lines that will maintain elevated temperature." In the waist gun position, Sergeant Michael O'Brien was chewing gum. O'Brien chewed constantly, a nervous habit developed during his first missions when he discovered that working his jaw helped calm his nerves during flak barrages. He bought gum by the carton at the base exchange, going through 3 or 4 packs per mission. As he watched Kowalski trying to wrap cloth around hydraulic lines with no real success, O'Brien became aware of the wad of gum in his mouth. He had been chewing the same piece for nearly an hour, warming it with his mouth, keeping it soft and pliable in the freezing aircraft interior. On impulse, he took it out and pressed it against a section of hydraulic line. The gum stuck immediately, conforming to the curve of the line, maintaining contact. O'Brien held his hand near it and could feel warmth radiating from the gum, heat retained from his mouth. "Hey," O'Brien called out, "I think I have got something." Within minutes, every man in the aircraft was contributing. They pulled out gum from personal supplies, flight rations, survival kits. Some had gum, others had hard candy that could be chewed into a soft mass. They chewed furiously, warming each piece to body temperature, then passed it forward to the crew chief, who pressed it onto the hydraulic lines in the wheel wells and along the fuselage runs. The effect was not dramatic, but it was measurable. The gum acted as both thermal mass and insulation. Warmed to 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit in the mouth, it transferred that heat to the metal lines. And once applied, it formed an insulating layer that reduced heat loss to the surrounding frigid air. Zimmerman broadcast the technique to the entire formation. "All aircraft, try this. Have all crew members chew gum or hard candy until warm, then apply it directly to hydraulic lines in the wheel wells and any accessible runs. Focus on the landing gear extension circuits." Across the formation, 420 men became a gum-chewing factory. Pilots and co-pilots flew their aircraft with one hand, while chewing gum with mechanical determination. Bombardiers, navigators, radio operators, and gunners all contributed. The aircraft filled with the smell of spearmint, cinnamon, and various fruit flavors, as men worked through every piece of gum they could find. Technical Sergeant William Jackson, a hydraulic systems specialist riding as passenger in one of the aircraft, began directing the effort with engineering precision. "Prioritize the actuator mechanisms," he called over the intercom. "Those have the tightest tolerances and will freeze first. Build up layers at junction points where cold air infiltration is worst." Men crawled through cramped spaces, squeezing into wheel wells and access tunnels, applying warm gum to cold metal with fingers that grew numb despite their heavy gloves. They rotated positions, some chewing while others applied, maintaining a continuous cycle of heat transfer. Chen monitored the hydraulic pressure gauges. The rate of pressure loss slowed, then stabilized. It was still dropping, but much more gradually. Instead of minutes until complete failure, they now had perhaps an hour, maybe more if they could maintain the effort. But maintaining the effort was becoming its own challenge. The human body can only produce so much saliva, can only chew for so long before jaw muscles fatigue, and they were running out of gum. Kosciuszko looked at the gauges, then at his watch, then at the navigation plot. "We are still 40 minutes from Wendling. At current consumption rates, we will run out of gum in about 20 minutes. We need another solution for the final approach." Rosenbaum spoke up from the nose. "What if we descend? air temperature increases roughly 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit per 1,000 feet of altitude loss. If we drop to 10,000 feet, outside air temperature should be around 0 degrees instead of 40 below. That is a 40-degree difference. Zimmermann considered this. Descending meant higher fuel consumption. It also meant exposing the formation to any remaining German aircraft that might be operating at lower altitudes. But the mathematics were clear. Without landing gear, the mission ended in catastrophe regardless of fuel state or enemy action. All aircraft, group lead. We are descending to 10,000 feet. Maintain formation. Watch for ice accumulation on flight surfaces as we enter warmer air. The formation began a gradual descent, trading altitude for temperature. As they dropped through 15,000 feet, Chen noticed frost forming on the inside of the cockpit windows, moisture from their breath freezing as it contacted cold surfaces. But the hydraulic pressure gauges showed stabilization. The rate of pressure loss had stopped entirely. At 10,000 feet, outside air temperature was 2 degrees Fahrenheit, brutally cold by ordinary standards, but a tropical heat wave compared to the 40 below environment they had left. The hydraulic lines, insulated now by layers of chewed gum and exposed to air that was 40 degrees warmer, began to slowly recover pressure as ice crystals in the fluid melted. Chen watched the gauges with an intensity usually reserved for watching approaching fighters. Pressure in System 3 began ticking upward, 2,200 pounds per square inch, 2,250, 2,300. The climb was slow but unmistakable. The English Channel appeared ahead, a grey sheet of winter water that marked the boundary between occupied Europe and home. The formation crossed the coast at Felixstowe, turning northwest toward Wendling. Radio operators contacted the control tower, reporting the situation, requesting emergency equipment to be standing by just in case. At Wendling, the fire crews and ambulances deployed to the runway edge. Medical personnel stood ready, but they would not be needed, at least not for the crisis everyone had feared. The first aircraft in the formation entered the landing pattern. Kosciuszko flew, concentrating on maintaining precise airspeed and altitude. Chen monitored the hydraulic systems, ready to troubleshoot. At the appropriate point in the approach, Kosciuszko activated the landing gear extension switch. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then they felt the thunk of mechanical locks releasing. The gear position indicators began moving. The hydraulic pumps labored, moving fluid through lines coated with the accumulated gum of 10 men's determined chewing. And then, blessed relief, 3 green lights on the instrument panel indicating gear down and locked. Kosciuszko let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. Gear down, 3 green, he keyed the radio. Group lead, this is Red 3, successful gear extension. Landing gear appears normal. Aircraft after aircraft reported the same result. The landing gear systems, kept just barely functional by the most improvised repair in aviation history, performed their designed function. 42 B-24 Liberators landed safely that December afternoon, their wheel wells and hydraulic lines decorated with multicolored masses of chewed gum that would puzzle the maintenance crews until the story emerged. The debriefing that evening at Wendling took an unusual turn. Normally, such sessions focused on target assessment, flak intensity, fighter encounters, and bombing accuracy. This time, the intelligence officers found themselves documenting an engineering improvisation that had no precedent in military aviation history. Captain Zimmermann insisted on a complete technical analysis. Chief Warrant Officer Stanley Kowalczyk, the group's senior maintenance officer, led the investigation. When they pulled inspection panels and examined the hydraulic systems, they found exactly what the crew descriptions had suggested. The lines were coated with gum, dozens of different varieties and flavors, applied in layers that sometimes measured a quarter-inch thick. Kowalczyk supervised careful testing. They measured the thermal properties of the gum layers, finding that they provided insulation roughly equivalent to that of foam rubber. More importantly, the gum had remained pliable enough to flex with the hydraulic lines during landing gear operation, instead of cracking or breaking loose. The engineering analysis revealed why the improvisation had worked. Chewed gum at body temperature contains approximately 65% water. along with gum-based sweeteners and flavorings. When pressed against cold metal, the water content provides thermal mass that releases heat as it cools. The gum base provides flexibility and adhesion. Together, they create a temporary insulating layer that performs far better than its humble origins would suggest. Kowalczyk wrote a formal report that was distributed to all 8th Air Force bombardment groups. Within weeks, multiple other units reported successful use of the chewing gum technique to address various cold-weather mechanical problems. Maintenance crews began including gum in their emergency repair kits, though this was done informally rather than through official supply channels. The story reached the headquarters of the 8th Air Force at High Wycombe. Lieutenant General James Doolittle, commanding the 8th, read Zimmerman's after-action report with the kind of attention usually reserved for accounts of major tactical innovations. Doolittle had led the famous raid on Tokyo in April 1942, launching twin-engine bombers from an aircraft carrier in an operation that required exactly the kind of creative problem-solving that Zimmerman's crews had demonstrated. Doolittle sent a personal commendation to the 392nd Bombardment Group, praising their resourcefulness, but he also directed his engineering staff to investigate why so many aircraft had experienced simultaneous hydraulic failures. The investigation revealed systemic problems with hydraulic fluid quality control at forward supply depots, where fluids were being stored in unheated warehouses and contaminated with moisture during transfer operations. New procedures were implemented. Hydraulic fluid would now be stored only in heated facilities. Transfer operations would be conducted using sealed pumping systems instead of open funnels. Aircraft that had been in service for more than 100 hours would receive mandatory hydraulic system flushes and refills. These changes, prompted by the near disaster of December 19th, prevented countless future failures. But the immediate impact was more personal. The 420 men who flew that mission understood that they had survived not because of superior firepower or tactical advantage, but because someone had the presence of mind to try an absurd solution that happened to work. It was a lesson in the value of creative thinking under pressure, of being willing to attempt solutions that seemed ridiculous because the alternative was unacceptable. Technical Sergeant Chen kept a piece of gum in his flight suit pocket for the rest of his tour. It was not a lucky charm exactly, though he would not have flown without it. It was a reminder that the most sophisticated weapon systems ever devised by human engineering could be saved by something as simple as spearmint gum warmed in a frightened man's mouth. The story spread through the bomber groups stationed in England. It became part of the informal education that veterans passed to replacement crews, along with lessons about flak evasion and formation flying. New crews arriving in the European theatre of operations heard about it during their orientation, usually told by maintenance personnel who wanted to emphasize that survival sometimes depended on thinking beyond the technical manuals. The German intelligence services, analyzing reports of Allied bomber operations, never did understand why the American formations that appeared on December 19th showed no apparent hydraulic system problems despite the extreme cold. Luftwaffe technical staff had predicted that such conditions would ground many Allied aircraft or cause significant losses during landing operations. When neither occurred, they assumed the Americans had developed some new hydraulic fluid formulation or heating system. They devoted considerable resources to investigating American hydraulic technology, never imagining that the solution was being chewed by every crew member. After the conflict ended, Chen returned to his home in San Francisco and enrolled in engineering school using benefits from the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. He eventually worked for Lockheed Aircraft Corporation, contributing to the design of the C-130 Hercules transport aircraft. When his team faced a design challenge involving hydraulic system reliability in extreme cold, Chen told them the story of December 19, 1944. The solution they developed, a system that used engine bleed air to maintain hydraulic line temperature, was more sophisticated than chewed gum, but the principle was the same: identify the critical failure point and find a way to add heat. Kosciuszko flew his required 35 missions and returned to Wisconsin, where he started a crop dusting business that grew into a regional agricultural aviation company. He kept a photograph on his office wall showing his B-24 crew standing beside their aircraft at Wendling. When customers asked about his military service, he usually told them about the missions over Germany, the fighters and flak, the close calls and narrow escapes. But sometimes, with people he trusted, he told them about the day they almost died because of frozen hydraulic fluid, and how they survived because someone thought to chew gum. Zimmerman continued in military service after the conflict, eventually retiring as a colonel. He taught at the Air Force Institute of Technology, where he used the chewing gum incident as a case study in crisis management and creative problem solving. His students, training to become the next generation of military leaders, learned that the most important quality in combat was not following the manual but knowing when to improvise solutions the manual writers had never imagined. The B-24 Liberators that flew that mission were eventually retired from service, replaced by newer designs that incorporated all the technological lessons learned during the conflict. But somewhere in the storage archives of the National Museum of the United States Air Force, there exists a section of hydraulic line from one of those aircraft, still coated with the dried remnants of spearmint gum. It sits in a climate-controlled storage room, alongside sections of aluminum from the first jet fighters, fragments of V-2 rocket engines, and other artifacts of technological warfare. Museum curators who encounter it in the catalogue sometimes puzzle over the notation that describes it as an example of field-expedient thermal management. Those who know the full story understand that it represents something more important than thermal management. It represents the ingenuity of ordinary people facing extraordinary problems, the creativity that emerges when failure is not an option, and the simple truth that sometimes the most sophisticated problems have the most humble solutions. The 42 aircraft that flew home that December afternoon carried 168,000 pounds of sophisticated electronics, hydraulics, and mechanical systems representing millions of hours of engineering development and hundreds of thousands of dollars in manufacturing costs. They were saved by something that cost approximately 5 cents per pack and could be found in any corner store in America. It was perhaps the greatest return on investment in the history of military aviation, and it happened because someone was willing to try something that seemed absurd until it worked. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.